This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
So precious time is that time of saying, you know, your I'm sorry's and your I love you's and your thank yous and goodbyes and that sort of thing, because it makes the after death so much. It doesn't make it easy, it makes it easier.
This is the Heart of Hospice podcast with Helen Bauer. The hospice doctor's widow, Jennifer O'Brien, is my guest today, talking about caregiving for someone with a life-limiting illness and how to make the most of precious time. Whether you're a family caregiver or an end-of-life professional, the Heart of Hospice is here to enhance your hospice experience by connecting you with information you can use about end-of-life care.
This episode of the Heart of Hospice podcast is sponsored by the Tree of Life Conference by International Doula Life Movement. Join IDLM at the Tree of Life Conference in San Antonio, Texas, November 1st through the 4th. The Tree of Life Conference is more than just workshops and seminars. It's an opportunity to connect, learn, and renew your commitment to compassionate care. Attendees will hear from expert speakers like end-of-life educator Barbara Carnes and Death Deck co-creator Lisa Paul. Visit internationaldoulalifemovement.com for more details.
My guest today is a return guest, Jennifer O'Brien. Jennifer O'Brien has been a practice management consultant to physicians, served as CEO for 2 large medical practices, and held administrative positions in 3 academic medical centers. She's had over 35 years in healthcare. She has authored over 50 articles in professional publications in peer-reviewed journals. The art journal that Jennifer kept as a form of self-care during her late husband's 22-month illness was published as The Hospice Doctor's Widow, a Journal. It's won several awards for both the content and its design. It's very unique, very beautiful. Now, Jennifer is sharing her story, her wisdom, and her experience to help others understand the role of family caregivers and the importance of end-of-life preparations. She is a friend, and she's got an amazing story to tell. She is going to be sharing her experiences taking care of her husband, Bob, who was a hospice doctor. She talks with me about the advanced care planning conversations they had. They were an important part of her relationship with Bob. You'll hear her talk about Bob's reluctance to engage in hospice for his end-of-life care. And he didn't want to die at home. She's going to talk more about that as well. You're going to hear her describe her new downloadable resource called Precious Time. It's a resource that helps healthcare workers communicate end-of-life realities to patients and their families in a very compassionate, relatable, and kind way. And it's worth mentioning that resource is free. That's a free download. So here's my conversation with Jennifer O'Brien. Jennifer, welcome back to the Heart of Hospice podcast.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
It's so great to connect with you again. It seems like it's been such a long time.
Well, it kind of has. I mean, there's been a whole worldwide pandemic in the meantime.
A lot of life going on. So it's great to have you back on the show.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you a different icebreaker question today, even though I know you. This is something different. I have a set of like 50 questions. This is my favorite. because it's pretty outrageous. If you were the ruler of the whole world, who would you talk to for advice? Who would be your advisors?
I would have a big team of advisors. I'm a big believer in advisors. So perhaps mostly who I consider an advisor are my dead relatives.
So you would talk, it would be advisors from the beyond.
There would be many advisors, many earthly living human being advisors. I can think of so many, but really, I try to be guided by my experience with them, having lost them, and what they believed in, love, and that sort of thing.
I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. I never had anybody say that they would have dead people as advisors, but that's really good. I like that a lot.
Well, when I do, I'm wearing my wedding ring today. When I do something like this, I really want Bob with me. And that's just how it works.
I love that. He stays connected. That's perfect. Well, and that's perfect for today, for what we're talking about it, because we are talking about this connection and the meaning that you've made out of your experience with Bob and his illness. You have an unusual book and sort of an unusual title that you have earned, The Hospice Doctor's Widow, which, 50 years ago would have just made you a little old lady in a black dress and sensible shoes and support pantyhose. But for you, it's this unique project that you have turned into so much meaning and generosity with your experience. Tell me about Bob and your journey with him.
Bob and I met late in life. We had gotten the starter marriages over with, and we fell in love very quickly and thoroughly and got married. And there were lots of reasons that I fell in love with Bob, but perhaps one of the bigger ones was the fact that he was a hospice and palliative care physician. He had been a plastic surgeon for a long time, but had had a neck injury that made operating very, very painful. And so he chose to retrain in hospice and palliative care. I, meanwhile, had already lost my mother and my brother. So I knew how important that work was that he was doing. We fell in love, and we got married, and we had this really great life. We lived in this big house and spent most of our time alone together. He was very introverted, so he expended all of his extroversion at work in the hospital. And so when he wasn't working, he wanted to replenish, and I was happy to accommodate that and just be with him. And we were married for a few years when he discovered a couple of lumps on the left side of his neck, which after some diagnostics turned out to be a metastatic site of a renal clear cell carcinoma, and it was diagnosed at stage 4, a lot of metastases at that point. And so we knew pretty quickly that, he would die of the disease or some complication from it or from a treatment. So we were then, called upon to turn a lot of his experience professionally and my experience personally on ourselves and try to get through it. And so I kept, I'm a self-taught artist, and I kept an art journal during his illness while I was taking care of him. Neither of us had kids. I was his only family caregiver. And I kept this art journal, and I kept going with it he lived for 22 months following the diagnosis, and I kept going with the journal for another 1.5 years after he died. At which point, I also have been in healthcare my entire career on the leadership, administrative, practice management side of physician organizations. So I do a lot of interim leadership. And after Bob died, I took another interim CEO position for a large multi-specialty practice. And a neurologist that I worked with there was in the process of diagnosing 3 different patients with ALS. And so I brought my journal into him because he was pretty upset about it. And he read my journal and then told me I wasn't getting it back, that he was going to loan it to these patients and their spouses, and that if I should really try to get that published. He said, you could help a lot of people if that were a book. And that was just really compelling. And so I did. I went to work, found a publisher, and the book was released as The Hospice Doctor's Widow, a Journal. I really feel that title is concise. It's an interesting title. It's caused people some problems when they want to give the book as a gift. They get all weirded out that I'm telling the person I'm giving this to that their person is going to die, and I'm like, yeah, well, the person
Yeah. Truth. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. The death rate's still 100%. So
Exactly.
that's how that story came, and that's how I got that name, The Hospice Doctor's Widow. And it's funny because, of course, I'm sure there are many other hospice doctor's widow. There's not just me. I am technically a hospice doctor's widow, but whatever. I'm the first one, I guess, to write a book about it.
Well, the book is very unique, and it's super heavy in the reflections that you share, but it's in small snippets. It's practical. It's very relatable. You are very raw and very real about your feelings and reflections back on what was happening and the interactions between you and Bob, because you guys had, the typical ups and downs in the middle of this health crisis that he was experiencing and the grief that you were experiencing as you went through it. And you document all of that. In a way, it really is a journal that documents that journey. But the artwork that you include with it is incredibly meaningful, and it's very unusual. And I'll have a link to your website and to the book so that people can go in and purchase. I have a copy, and I think it's amazing. It is an amazing book.
Thank you so much.
I want to focus on a specific thing today because you've been on the show before and we have talked about your experience with Bob and his illness. I want to focus on advanced care planning because I know you were a huge advocate of these kind and honest and open conversations. How easy or difficult was it for you and Bob, both as healthcare workers of a sort, and of course Bob was much more in tune to the clinical piece of things, how easy or difficult was it for you to have those advanced care plan conversations between the two of you and with Bob's healthcare team?
Okay, so this is a little bit unusual, we had them very thoroughly long before Bob got a diagnosis.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't think he could have done that work without having his own house in order. I mean, that just didn't, and neither one of us for that matter, we talked about it. We signed very, very thorough advanced directives long before he got sick. Yeah. I had a really good idea of what he wanted and what he didn't want just from the dinner table discussions, he'd come home and talk about patients and say, this person, whatever wants this. And then he'd tell the story and then he'd be like, yeah, Jen, I'm not going to want that.
Yeah, don't ever do that to me.
Don't do that to me.
Right.
So anyway, it was, and that's one of the reasons I feel so strongly about this is because the truth is, Helen, that as thoroughly as we discussed it before he got sick, it was still hard once he got sick, right? Like everything changes when a diagnosis comes in the picture. And it doesn't have to be a terminal diagnosis. I mean, his was, but it can be, a survivable cancer diagnosis. And it is still when I say everything changes, I don't mean the plans necessarily change, although they may. I mean the emotional component of it changes. But it was so incredibly helpful to have had all of those conversations and all of those documents as the touchstone, once he did get sick. That there's actually a really funny story about our advance directives. About anyway, I had a question that I would periodically ask him. So okay, I'm just going to tell the story. What the heck?
Just tell it. Just tell it.
The first time Bob and I slept together.
Oh, that I wasn't expecting that.
And I do mean sleep, not just, because I'm not a great sleeper. So that's the bigger commitment for me, is to actually sleep. But we of course got friendly. And then after all that was over, he kind of sighed back in the bed and said, well, if I have a heart attack in my sleep, don't call the EMTs until I'm cold and blue.
And that was the first time you were intimate, and this is what he said. This is pillow talk afterwards?
Yes, this is the pillow talk.
Oh, my God.
And a couple of things. One, it was good sex, right? Like, that's the answer there. And two, I had an idea of what his advanced directives were. So having said all...
I don't think we've talked about this on the show before. This is good.
So having said all that, I could periodically say to him, do you still not want me? Whether well or in crisis or in, everything, all things being equal, I could say, so you still don't want me to call the ENTs, right?
Yeah, it was like you said, it was the touchstone, the foundation of things.
Exactly. That one happens to be a fun one, but, that is so great to have something to say. Is that where you still are? Because if you're not, that's fine. Just let me know. So yeah, we had thoroughly discussed it.
Well,
That's right.
Okay, I feel like we know each other very, very well at this point. I feel like I know Bob a little bit too. No, I think those things are important because, okay, so not to make a joke about the whole intimacy thing, but advanced care plan conversations are very intimate. And I'm not talking about physically intimate, sexually intimate. They speak to the very heart.
Closeness, there is nothing like it. It's a closeness. So yes, that's a funny story and it involves sexual intimacy. But the truth is, you're absolutely right. It is one of the most intimate things you can do in your commitment to another human being. There's a closeness in sharing those very profound and personal wishes. There's a commitment in hearing them, accepting them, and accepting the responsibility to carry them out regardless of what yours are.
Right.
And so absolutely, all humor aside, you are 100% right, Helen. That is about as intimate as it gets. And it's one of the things I talk about frequently when I'm trying to get people to understand how powerful this stuff of advance directives and just simply talking about end of life is with the people you love. Yeah.
Yeah. So did you ever have a time as Bob's caregiver and decision maker that his wishes didn't align with what you wanted to do?
Not quite like that. First of all, Bob, I never had until the last 48 hours or so, I didn't have to assert myself as a proxy. Mm-hmm. He was clear-headed. He was very much in charge. He was he was the doctor. And I mean, he was not going to give that up easily or willingly. So there certainly wasn't that. Ironically, there was a real issue with his decision to admit himself to hospice status. And I've kind of gone over this in my head a lot since well, mainly since the book came out, because one doesn't really talk about these things until you allow your journal to be published and people want to talk about it. But
and then your story's out there for everybody.
right. Oh, there we go. Anyway, I think I understand now, again, in hindsight, and I wish I'd understood better when it was happening. He was very reluctant to admit himself to a hospice status, even though he was not taking any treatment. The last chemotherapy that he'd been prescribed was an oral, and he had decided not to take it. And I knew that. I don't even know if his oncologist knew that he wasn't taking it. And we had a couple of 2 to 4 weeks of very rough time here, where he would have really bad nights, high fever, all kinds of horrible stuff. And I would get, of course, I'm not a clinical person, right? I'm doing my best, but it's all really scary to me.
Sure.
And in fact, it's in the journal because it was one day. It was probably about 2 weeks before he died. He'd had a particularly bad night. And I brought it up again. I brought it up a couple of times, just like, hey, that was rough. And thinking, geez, I'd really like you to admit yourself to, I was very careful about what was important to me was that he got the end of life that he wanted. And what he wanted was to continue to be in control of his situation. He wanted his privacy from his partners and other people in the community. And I was determined to give that to him. So I was very careful about not pushing. But anyway, one day, like I said, it was a particularly bad night. And I said, wow, that was rough. And he said, he got really cross with me and he said, Jen, I'm dying. What's the worst that happens? I die. And I said, Bob, that's not the worst that happens. I said, if you die and I walk back into this bedroom and you've died, I know what to do. I know who to call. I said, but if you fall out and you have a seizure or you hit your head and you've told me, we're back to that story, don't call the EMTs until I'm cold and blue.
Right.
Well, what do I do then? You leave me with like, what do I do? And then the sheriff, I live in Arkansas. The sheriff shows up in a couple of weeks and says, lady, you let your husband die.
Yes, you left him on the floor. Mm-hmm.
Right. And his eyes got really wide and he realized I had a very valid point, and he called and started the process because he knew that if all that happened while he was on hospice status, then I would simply call hospice and they would help me, make him comfortable until he died. But if he wasn't on a hospice status, then we were in trouble, right? So. Yeah. So that was a big, and then I also know, and I knew this then, but I wasn't connecting the dots. I knew he did not want to die at home. I knew I could get him into a facility. I knew I was capable of that, but I didn't tell him that. And I think that was his other reluctance. He was like not sick enough to be admitted to a hospice facility, but he didn't want to die at home. And I knew I could handle taking care of him at home and then getting him into a facility before he died, which I did.
Jen, I've heard you tell this story about Bob before, but I don't remember the component about his not wanting to die at home. What was his reason for not wanting to be at home when he died?
I never did ask him that, but I can tell you what I think it was. He started working in a hospital when he was 18 years old as an orderly. And he worked in a hospital for 50 years. And he was more at home in a hospital than sometimes he was at home. And I think, I know it's hospice facility is not a hospital, but, and he knew that too, but a facility, that is where he felt comfortable. He was very, very at home in a healthcare facility. Yeah. And I think that's what it was. I think that's why he wanted to die inpatient hospice.
I think that's super important for people to hear, because a lot of times, especially people who work in end-of-life care, we think that quote-unquote good death happens at home, right? We don't like the mechanized or the medicalized deaths that occur in a hospital, but some people just don't want to die at their own home. And there are numerous reasons. I was just curious about Bob's, his thinking. But he was so at home in facilities, healthcare facilities, so it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
I am loving this conversation, but we're going to take a break right now. There's more to come.
In a world where compassion and community are needed more than ever, the International Doula Life Movement presents the Tree of Life Conference. Join IDLM November 1st through the 4th in San Antonio, Texas for an extraordinary experience in end-of-life care. The Tree of Life Conference is not just an event, it's a movement towards making a positive impact. Attendees will hear from expert speakers, including award-winning end-of-life educator Barbara Carnes, Lisa Paul of the Death Deck, Brenda Kazire and Nancy Hireman of Odonata Care, and end-of-life advocate Helen Bauer, host of the Heart of Hospice podcast. The Tree of Life Conference is more than just workshops and seminars. It's an opportunity to connect, learn, and renew your commitment to compassionate care. This event is made possible by the team at International Doula Life Movement, who believes in the power of empathy, education, and making a difference in the world. Don't miss out on this transformative experience. Join IDLM at the Tree of Life Conference in San Antonio, Texas from November 1st through the 4th. Visit internationaldoulalifemovement.com for more details and secure your spot today.
When you were having advanced care plan discussions with Bob's healthcare team, how did that go? Was it easy or difficult? Or, did you have those conversations?
We didn't. Those conversations were all private between us. Our palliative care was all DIY.
Really?
There was no palliative care team. And I think the person who suffered the most because of that was me.
Yes.
Bob knew what he was doing. But the recognition of the toll things take on the family caregiver, wasn't there because we didn't have palliative care. It was purely a privacy thing. He didn't want to be the patient of his partners and his fellows. He just didn't. And again, I was determined to give him everything he wanted in terms of the way that he lived and died. I was just absolutely determined. So, there was no discussion with the healthcare team about anything. There really was no team. I mean, there was an oncologist, but that was it. So
I think that's probably typical for a lot of people who work in end-of-life care, because they know what it's like to be vulnerable as a patient, because they've seen patients and families and how end-of-life workers come in for community-based care, and they are all up in your home. It's a very intimate setting. They are where you live and where you sleep and where you shower and you poop and you eat, and they are all in the middle of whatever family dynamics you happen to have in that household. It's a little like living in a fishbowl.
Oh, yeah.
And I have to say that if I worked for an agency, I don't know that I would want my previous coworkers coming in and witnessing whatever dysfunction I had going on, whatever bad habits, whatever relationship dynamics I had.
Totally.
I think that would be a huge privacy issue. And you'd have to wonder if people carried that information back to the office and water cooler gossip happened at your expense.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I like to think it wouldn't happen over bodily dysfunction, but it might happen over family dynamics. I can see that going on.
Yeah. Let's face it. Gossip is interesting.
It is.
Yeah, I would like to think that we are better than that, but end-of-life providers, hospice teams, we're all human,
That's right.
just like everybody else. So I think Bob's desire for privacy, that protective shell that he needed to keep on made perfect sense.
Yeah, it did. It did. But it also has helped me to make the case to the world for the importance of engaging palliative care. Go early, go often.
You're the cautionary tale. You know it because you lived it with Bob.
I knew what it provided to people. I believed in it. My husband went to work every day. We took calls in the middle of the night on this topic, and yet I did not have access to it when it would have helped me. So yes, please, 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 please go early, go often.
Yeah, absolutely. So as a caregiver, what do you think your superpowers were?
I think that my superpowers were the recognition that we were going through two different processes, that he was dying and I was surviving. And with that I would go on after he died and have to live with how I had handled our time together. And I, as a result, I had also lived that with my mother and my brother, right? They had preceded me in death. I knew what it was like after someone dies to have regrets, or hopefully no regrets, and that sort of thing. So that was my superpower. I became a much nicer person than I am. I became a little bit more subservient than I probably am in normal life because I wanted, as I've said several times, even in this conversation, I wanted him to have the end of life that he wanted and feel loved and respected and cared for on his terms. And so, yeah, that was my superpower, because it wasn't all the clinical stuff.
Oh, the clinical stuff, it's overrated, right? I shouldn't say that as a nurse, but I think you can find people to do the clinical stuff. But preserving Bob's dignity, remembering his wishes for how things go, that's a huge superpower. And everybody needs an advocate like that when it's their turn to consider a serious illness or a life-limiting illness for themselves.
Yeah, when he would consider a new treatment, I would just say to him, I support you in whatever you decide.
Yeah.
100%. You want to do it? You want to not do it? I support you. And that's how I tried to handle, even at the really difficult times. And there were many difficult times. I mean, as any family who has gone through a cancer diagnosis, even those who have lived through it and are still alive will tell you it wreaks havoc on a relationship. And so there were many, many times that were very difficult in the relationship, and I still maintained, for the most part, my superpower.
Wonderful. So part of the work that you do is to provide support and resources for other caregivers and for healthcare professionals as well, right? A lot of support and resources for us. You have a fantastic resource that you published not too long ago called Precious Time. Tell me about this, and who's the target audience for this particular resource?
So Precious Time goes back to when Bob was long before he got sick. He would use that term, and he would always say it with the emphasis on the word precious, which I at first thought was a Southern thing, umbrella insurance, precious time, but it wasn't. It's the type of time. He would tell the patient, the family, moreover, you're into precious time. And what the families understood from this and what he meant by it was, your death is coming. This is not going to go on forever. This is the precious time stage. And precious time is when you say what you need to say and you don't say what you will later regret. And that was, I think that was part of my superpower too, is I knew about precious time thanks to Bob. So I journaled about it, and so it's in the book. And as the book got out into the world, and a lot of doulas and healthcare professionals and hospice care professionals became familiar with the book, that was one item that really grew out of the book. In some ways, it became larger than the book. And I started to hear stories about people using that term in the correct way and it really helping them to communicate to people, it's coming. The end is coming. And so I created a free download that's called the Precious Time Implementation Guide for Healthcare Professionals. And it's a pretty robust little download. I should also say that Barbara Carnes wrote a blog about precious time, about the term and how powerful and effective it is. The Good Death asked me to write a guest blog about it. And so it's really getting out into the world. And that's when I decided I needed to put together something that would help healthcare professionals understand what I meant, what this term meant, and what the use of it is, and why to use it. Because I think, it's hard to tell someone your person is dying, right? It's really hard to do that. But if you say you're into precious time, it softens the whole thing quite a bit. It's a beautiful word, precious, right? It means a beautiful thing. And it's easier on the professional to convey that news using the term precious time than just about anything else I can think of. What was very important to Bob, and for that matter to me, more than being worried about, I think he did a great job coming up with this term so that he could tell people in a gentle way. But what he was trying to avoid more than anything was being a perpetuator of a false time frame and having people after the death of their loved one say, I thought we had more time, which is happening a lot in this world.
Sure.
Right? We've got people who have a cancer diagnosis for years, and that's great that it's able to be managed, but then they ultimately die of the cancer, or they die of a complication from the treatment, and their family is like, but I thought we had more time, right? But
Right.
With that diagnosis, to some degree, maybe precious time doesn't start at diagnosis like it kind of did for me and Bob. But it starts at some point where you realize just how precious what you have left is, and that you don't know when necessarily it's going to come to an end. So precious time is that time of saying, your I'm sorries and your I love yous, and your thank yous and goodbyes and that sort of thing, because it makes the after death so much. It doesn't make it easy. It makes it easier.
Yeah.
To know that you said everything you needed to say. So yeah, that's what the download is. It's for healthcare professionals, and it goes into some depth. And there's some case studies in there, which I'm really fond of. Some really great stories of when the term truly did help some folks, and at least one where it wasn't used, and that was a problem. Or nobody told this man that his wife was dying. And anyway, so it's worth it. It's worth every penny.
Well, and the reason it's worth every penny, it's priceless. It truly is. But it's also free. It's a free download.
It is a free download.
So one of the things that strikes me about what you're saying is when healthcare professionals use that particular term, precious time, for one thing, it's not healthcare lingo.
Right.
I can tell you, your dad's got a life-limiting illness. That's my way of saying you have a limited amount of time. You need to cherish it. But if I said, you're in precious time, it's something to be cherished and understand it's a limited quantity and you should not waste it. It communicates so much better than saying, well, your dad has a life-limiting illness and a life expectancy of 6 months.
Right.
He has a terminal prognosis.
Right.
But when you're talking to people who are drinking from the fire hose, they're overwhelmed, they're trying to take in and navigate an industry and a system that is so convoluted. Our healthcare system is so complex. And then you're going to use this lingo with them, and you're going to take 10 minutes to do it and send them on their way.
Yeah.
I mean, that's unconscionable to care for people like that. That's not care.
Right.
That's not care. So to be able to use this resource and do the case studies, because there are places to take notes and jot down questions and even have discussion. I think you could use it as a discussion tool, and to say precious time to communicate in an easier way. And I think it softens us as healthcare professionals, end-of-life conversationalists, because those are the conversations we're supposed to be having, right? End of life. And I don't think we're all that great at it a lot of times. We don't have more time than most people. We try to take more time with our patients and their families. But for us to be able to use a term that softens us immediately, precious time.
Yeah.
And let's talk about why I use that term. Yeah, your resource says all those things, and it's really a great tool. It's not super long. It's not complicated. No, and it's a free download. You can't beat that.
You'll read through it in a few minutes, and if you take some time with the case study, the case studies are quick, but they're good stories about when it's been used successfully, and why it was a success, kind of thing. And you're right, there is space for jotting down some notes because that's what story does, right? It makes you think of some stuff, and then there's a section in there about, let's talk about, I believe. I also have a slideshow when I teach precious time. And I know this is in the slideshow, so it's got to be in the handout, in the download. And it's about, what's your worst fear? Like, let's play through what is your worst fear that this person's going to do when you start this conversation or when you finish saying what you have to say,
Yeah.
Cry. Well, you can handle that.
They're probably going to do that anyway.
Yes. They got to scream and yell. Well, you can handle that too. You know what I mean? I think I always think working through those what if fears is such a helpful exercise, because at that point you just name them and then figure out, well, what will you do if that happens? And most of the time, some of them are kind of silly, and then the ones that aren't silly, okay, well, let's talk about how you would handle that if that were to happen. And I encourage people to do that, like sort out what is it that you're so afraid of?
Yeah.
Because I'm going to tell you what, far worse than telling someone you're into precious time is hearing them afterwards when they thought they had all kinds of time to say what they needed to say.
Right.
Or, not bother with making a fuss over something.
And time is a huge question for patients and families.
Yes, it is.
It truly is. They don't have a whole lot of it. We shouldn't waste it.
Right.
Yeah. And we want them to make use of it.
But, the average duration for a family caregiver is 4.9 years. Okay. So I was only at it for 22 months with my husband, but the average is 4.9 years. So when you think about that, the shift from life-sustaining family caregiver to end-of-life hospice family caregiver is extraordinary, right? Like you've been at this for 5, sometimes 10 years, where every single day, your reason for being is to get that guy up and out of the house and fed and right and feeling as good as he can possibly feel. And then at some point, we shift into end of life and hospice type family caregiving. Most people do not have a lot of experience with that. And it's a whole different focus, right? We have a whole different goal in mind. And that's a very difficult shift for people to make. I happen to believe that in the hospice world, we're not doing a good enough job getting those family caregivers from life-sustaining family caregiver to end-of-life family caregiver. And that if we were a little bit more effective at that, it would probably, certainly would be easier on the family caregiver or smoother. And it would probably be easier on the professional caregivers, right? Because it'd be a lot less of the, I don't understand, but you said this, and phone call. It probably would cut down on the calls to the 24-hour line in a lot of ways.
Right. People who take themselves off of hospice or go to the emergency room because they're frightened about what's going on. This is a very good example of our patients. The majority of them are only with us for 2 weeks.
I know.
2 weeks.
I know.
And yet they've been caregiving, like you're saying, for what?
Sometimes years.
Yes, especially Alzheimer's and dementia caregivers. Those long disease trajectories.
Long disease, and those also have a very short hospice length of stay typically.
Typically we do. Those are our longest length of stays most of the time. But sometimes we don't really know when to pick them up for care, and their caregivers don't know either. But it all comes back to those advanced care plan conversations and having them with the healthcare team, right, which is not always an easy thing. But one thing I will say, for anybody who's listening who is a caregiver currently, you don't have to wait for your healthcare team, your physician, nurse practitioner to initiate those conversations. If you want to talk about them, you talk about them. You can bring it up. You can initiate that conversation, and you should.
100%. 100%.
Absolutely. So who exactly is the target audience for that precious time download?
The target audience is healthcare professionals in general. Although, interestingly, I know a woman who's a widow. She happens to be a physical therapist, but she's a widow, and she interviewed me for a widow podcast. And her sister, who had been ill for a long time recently, died. And about a week or so before her sister died, she wrote to me and said, "Jennifer, your precious time is really helping me communicate with my family about what's happening with my sister." And I referred her to the download for that.
Nice. So any healthcare professional, any discipline, because really it just helps us communicate in general when it comes to talking with somebody who has limited life expectancy, limited time.
Yes. Any healthcare professional, any discipline, absolutely. I would not hesitate to download it because it happens, right? End of life happens, even when it's not necessarily your area of specialty. There's one story. One of the case studies is about an ICU nurse who had read my book, and they had a patient in the unit, and she was very clearly dying. That was abundantly clear to everyone, including the physician. But he didn't want to be the bearer of bad news. So he wasn't going to tell the family. And this nurse, in my opinion, very courageously, sat him down and told him about Bob and told him about precious time and said, "This is this family's precious time. And if you don't tell them, then they're going to miss it."
Yeah. And
sure enough, he got on the phone and called that family in, and they were able to be there before their person died. So, it's not necessarily hospice folks that need to know this term and how to use it. I think just about anybody in healthcare. Yeah, I would like to see everyone using it.
Yeah. If we're supposed to be having these upstream conversations, right?
Yes.
Which is earlier and often. Isn't that what you say? Have it early, have it often? Yeah. So how can listeners connect with you, get the Precious Time download, and connect with your newsletter?
So go to my website, which is hospicedoctorswidow.com. And there's a resources page that has the Precious Time download as well as a number of other downloads. And when you give me your email address to receive the download, you are signing up for my newsletter. So you'll get that. Or if you're not interested in any downloads, at the bottom of every page of my website is a sign on for the newsletter.
And it's a fantastic newsletter. I subscribe. I think it's great. Lots of good reflection, good resources. Jen, thanks for talking with me again today and being back on the show. So glad to see you and talk with you.
It's been wonderful, Helen.
Be sure to catch the next episode of the Heart of Hospice podcast. You can find more episodes on theheartofhospice.com. And don't forget to follow us on your favorite podcast platform. You can connect with the Heart of Hospice on Facebook and Instagram and send your questions or comments by email to helen@theheartofhospice.com. So remember, no matter who you are or where you are in your hospice journey, you are the heart of hospice.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time.